Hello and welcome to Lesson 5 of Changing Cities. This session is going to be looking at Norwich's population characteristics and this term called deindustrialisation. Don't be intimidated by this term, it is very straightforward, and I'm going to show you examples of causes of deindustrialisation in Norwich and also some of the impacts of it. So before we start looking at Norwich's population characteristics, we really need to understand what we mean by population structure. And population structures are represented often by something called population pyramids, which I'm going to show you in a moment. But when we talk about population structure, we divide population into three broad categories. Young dependents are the youthful population, so they're the people that are from 0 to maybe 15 years of age. Elderly dependents, which are people ordinarily over 65, and then in between those two we've got what's called the working population. So the young and the elderly dependents are dependent because they rely on the working population to provide for them in terms of their financial kind of requirements. So the young dependents in terms of early years healthcare and education services, that's paid for by the taxpayer. Elderly dependents rely on their pensions and also healthcare services as well, and again that's paid for and funded by the taxpayer. So the working population really helps fund and helps support those young and elderly dependents. So the proportions of these are quite important, because if you've got too many young and elderly dependents and not enough people working in the population to pay for the services they use, then you're going to struggle to actually afford to pay for all those people that need that support. And so you really want to try and keep that population structure as balanced as possible. So when population structures are presented in a population pyramid, they're divided up in a couple of ways. Firstly, they're divided up into gender, so males and females. And so males will appear on one side, females on the other. They're also divided up into age categories, and the range is normally of 5-year bands, so 0 to 4, 5 to 9, and so on up until you get to 100 plus. Now, I've already mentioned they're represented by population pyramids, and those population pyramids and the shape of them at a glance can really give you a good idea as to whether you're looking at a developed place or a developing or emerging place. So let me show you a couple of those pyramids now. Pyramid A is representative of a very typical developing country, so a less developed, less economically developed country. So there's a high death rate. That means there's a high number of people that die per 1,000 of the population, a high birth rate, again a high number of births per 1,000 of the population, and a low life expectancy overall. So these dotted lines represent the boundary between the young dependents and the elderly dependents. So everything above this dotted line, elderly dependents, everything below, young dependents, and then everything in between, your working population or your economically active. So this pyramid on the left, which is the developing country, has a high birth rate, and I can tell that because it's got a really wide base, and that means lots and lots of babies born per 1,000 of the population. But unfortunately, a lot of those babies will, they won't survive fully into adulthood, because you can see the sides of this pyramid are very steep, and that means because they're getting smaller every time as you go up and forming this pyramid shape, it shows you that there's a lot of death going on in the process. I know, which sounds pretty grim, sorry. Also, the pyramid doesn't reach quite as far as this one, because the life expectancy doesn't look like it gets much above 65 years old. And also the population of people that are elderly dependents is actually quite low anyway, because it's a very narrow top. So it's got a high birth rate, wide base, a high death rate, so narrowing top, and low life expectancy, it's quite short. Now this pyramid is typical of a developed country, and it doesn't really look like a pyramid at all. It looks more like an egg shape, and sometimes we call these kind of honeycomb pyramids. And what you can see here is that there is a much lower birth rate, but because it maintains its shape most of the way, it's quite sort of square-sided, there's also a very low death rate. In fact, it looks as though the population's increasing as you go up. Now, obviously, that's because this is a snapshot of any one particular time. So at this particular time, there are fewer people in the 0 to 4 category, and actually roll on about 15 or so years, there were more people being born at the time, and those people have survived. They've lived to bulk out this working population. Unfortunately for these countries, well, I say unfortunately, it's not really that unfortunate. Alongside their low death rate and low birth rate, they've got a very high life expectancy, or much longer. So lots of people live into this elderly dependent category. Now that's unfortunate for the working population, and it will be even worse as fewer of them are replaced by a smaller amount of people being born, because that increases the pressure financially on these people in the population. So there's more people claiming pensions and needing healthcare services, even though there's slightly less being born and less requiring education services. The proportion is still sort of increasing overall, and the worst is yet to come. In that, if all of these people survive, which is what we want to see, unfortunately, the people coming through are not enough to replace and then fund their pensions. So what we find is things like pensions get delayed to, rather than 65, maybe 70 years, or people just don't retire at all, or they reduce the pension amount that you get. So this has its problems as well, even though, generally speaking, it looks quite positive that really nobody's dying that much. So there we go. The difference between population structures, young dependents, elderly dependents, working population, and the general difference between developing and developed countries in terms of their shape. Now, that's not the only way you can represent the three categories, and I just want to show you Norwich's before we do. And again, Norwich's represents, a weird look. It looks more like a rocket than a pyramid, but you can see very clearly here, Norwich fits. It's much closer to the developed country pyramid than the developing, because it's got a narrow base, and people survive quite heavily into sort of 90 plus years of age. You can see that the female side is much bigger when it comes to elderly people, because women generally live longer than men. That is statistically accurate information, and you can see there's large chunks of people in the 20 to 24 year age range, and again that might be looking at a previous lesson to do with migration in the sort of student area. Okay, so people going to UEA and maybe staying around there. So if you want to just have a bit of an activity to do while you're practicing some exam skills, try and describe that population structure and use terms like elderly dependents, young dependents, and working population in your description. Try and divide it into those three categories. So what's happening between the people sort of 0 to 15, what's happening to the people kind of over 65, relatively speaking, and again, are there any key statistics you can pick out? Now, the other thing is that we want to identify what this pyramid suggests about Norwich as a place. In short, we've already just covered that. This tells you that Norwich is a fairly well-developed place. People survive quite long into old age. Obviously, there is a decline from the age of sort of 65, which is natural because, as people age, that's what's going to happen. But there is still quite a large proportion of people living well past their 80s into sort of 90 plus territory. So that is definitely something which tells you that Norwich has well developed healthcare services and nutrition, and is a good place to live because lots of people are living into old age. It also tells you that it's a developed country because the birth rate is low, and as people get wealthier and want more stuff, more materialistic, they tend to not want to have so many families or as big families, and therefore this number stays quite low too. Okay, so now we've had a look at population pyramids. The other way to present this information is in something called a triangle graph. Now, again, don't be put off by this. This is just a way for me to show you other ways that data may be presented to you in an exam situation. So this is a way you could present that same thing. So rather than it being a pyramid that's got like young dependents at the bottom, then the working, then the elderly, what you've got is dividing up 100% of the population into those three categories. So these are your young dependents, and so the proportion of young dependents in this population is 30%. Okay, and so that one kind of goes along there. The elderly or the elderly dependents, the proportion in this population is about 11 or so percent. And again, you follow the line of this triangular graph there where they cross over, and that means that what's left should be about 50 whatever percent. Okay, so 58, 59%. So there you go. You've got the different proportions shown on this graph, and this is really just to show you how else this could be presented. You won't find these occurring very often, but I don't want you to be thrown if you happen to see one of these in an exam situation. Okay, so now we can start to look at some demographic facts. Demography just refers to how a population is kind of made up. What that population does, or how old it is, or what jobs they have, or how many people live in houses, etc. So these are all facts from the year 2001, which is a significant year, and I'll tell you why in a second. Okay, so these are facts from 2001 about the UK's population. So fact 1, 11% of the UK's population was born abroad in 2001. Mostly they were from India or Pakistan, and then a large proportion from Ireland as well. So more than 1 in 10 people in the UK in 2001 was born abroad. Fact number 2, there were almost 400,000 French people living in Britain in 2001, and because of the number of French people that actually lived in London, technically speaking, and not really, but technically speaking, London was the 5th biggest French city. So it was bigger than several other cities actually in France because the population of French people in London was so high. Almost 400,000 people listed their religion as Jedi in 2001, the plonkers. Young men were 3 times more likely to die than young women in 2001. And waiting tables, so being a waiter or a waitress, was the fastest growing occupation in Britain in 2001. All very fascinating, I'm sure you're aware, you'll agree, but how do we know all of this? How do I know these stats? What has told me all these facts and figures? Okay, the answer, I hope you're all shouting out the screen right now, is the census. Now, if you've never heard of the census before, I'm going to tell you what it is, and it might be worth you jotting down some information about it. So the census is, in the UK, is a count of all the people and all the households in the UK and loads of information about them. They hold one every 10-year period, and they have done since 1801. So 2001 was was not the latest census, was the census before the most recent one. So we are only a year or so away from the next census. So the 2021 census is likely to be held around March of 2021, obviously, and it will be basically a large survey, a big booklet, effectively, that might even go paperless now, that the families or the households will fill in as much detail and answer all the questions, and all that information is gathered. Now, you might think, why are we doing that? And is it just the government being nosy? And partly it maybe is, but the other part is that they actually, if they know lots about populations, they can work out where and how they need to spend money, and how they need to provide services. So it really is the most complete source of information about the UK's population that we have. So as a data source, it's a secondary data source. It's probably the most important secondary source of information in human geography, because it tells us so much about lots of things that we cover in human geography. And when you do some geography fieldwork in and around urban areas of Norwich, the census will be something which gives you some information that will be handy to you. So now we've got all this information, or we can access this information, how can we use it? Well, let's just show you a snapshot of Norwich. In 2011, Norwich's official population was 132,512. Over 80 different languages were spoken in Norwich as their first language, but obviously in quite low proportions. The diversity and ethnicity of people in Norwich, predominantly, like many cities in East Anglia, or many cities in the UK, it was white British. Norwich has quite a high proportion of white British people, nearly 85%. Another 5% or 5.4% were white but not British, so they'd be largely Eastern European. And then you've got the different other ethnicities, diversity areas, so black, African or British, Asian, Indian or British, Asian, Chinese or British, and then smaller degrees of other migrants, maybe students going to the UEA, for example. Religion, Norwich has a bit of a stat really. In this census, the 2011 census, it's officially the least religious city in the UK. I saw that stat somewhere. So actually, everywhere else has not a higher proportion of people that class themselves as not religious. So 42.5% of people that live in Norwich say they have no religion whatsoever. They're atheists. Christians, there's the largest proportion, again very traditional for most UK cities to be Christian, 44.9%. 8.2% didn't specify religion, and then you've got again smaller proportions of people that follow the Muslim faith, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, etc. So Norwich, not hugely diverse and not and the least religious city in the UK, but it still has diversity, and we just need to be aware of that. So the other thing that a census does, rather than just specifying Norwich in general, is it will divide up parts of Norwich so we can compare if we lived in one bit of Norwich to another bit of Norwich. Because I'm sure you're aware, if you've driven through Norwich, you know that some parts of Norwich are much more kind of upmarket and plush than other areas. And this is no disrespect to anybody that lives in these areas, but Mile Cross and the Larkman area are not necessarily known for being the most wealthy, the most affluent. Whereas if you go to other parts of Norwich, like the Eton wards, then they are far more wealthy in general. And that's just how you look driving through them. The houses are bigger in Eton. There's more green space. It feels a bit more healthy. There's like bigger cars on the driveways, that sort of thing. So Norwich is divided up into these areas called wards, and this slide shows you on the left all the different wards of Norwich. You've got Bowthorpe, Catton Grove, Crome, Eton, Lakenham, Mancroft, Milecross, Nelson, Sewell, Thorpe Hamlet, Town Close, University and Wensum. So these are all the different zones in Norwich. And what the UK census data can be used for is this thing, GIS. It's brilliant. Okay, effectively you get a map of a place and then you pick whatever you want to place over it as a statistic, and it'll color code it or put lines or it'll put shapes on there to tell you what place is what. So here you can see red represents one extreme of deprivation and green represents the other side, so less deprivation, for example. So you've got the most deprived areas of the city centre that tend to be around this north city region, around Magdalen Street, which is quite run down. This is where you find Anglia Square, for example, and maybe over here in Bowthorpe, this is where you'd find the Larkman estate. Up here near Helsden, this is the Mile Cross estate. So these are all places that statistically, not just me, in my opinion, these are darker colours because, or sorry, more red colours because they are more deprived. And we'll look at what deprivation is in a minute, but they're more deprived. Whereas you've got also quite wealthy, affluent areas in the green. They're less deprived. They've been redeveloped. There's houses here that are really green because they're old terraces that have been maybe regenerated as part of urban renewal. So we're going to get onto this a bit more in a minute, but just to show you kind of what a map can look like and with all the sort of data you can pick for it. So what I'd like you to do is have a little bit of a practice. What I want you to go on is this website called datashine.org.uk. If you just either click on this, but ideally you'd probably just go on to Google and then just type Datashine in, and it will come up with this page. Now what you need to do, it won't straight away go to Norwich. It'll ask you to come up with Norwich and zoom into Norwich. But once you have, you can then pick certain data sets that you want to show on the map, and then the color coding will tell you kind of the good areas, the bad areas, or the ones that have the most or the least. And you can do this for so many different characteristics. So you've got population basics, origin or beliefs, health data, so how healthy the population is, types of housing, quality of housing, education standards and levels. This is all stuff and questions that are asked in the census. They'll ask you what level of education you've got, for example. They'll ask you what you do for a living. They'll ask you how you get to work. They'll ask you about the type of house you live in and all sorts of other stuff. And that will tell you again and can feed in this data to these sorts of maps, which tell you, places that you may want to or may not want to live in future, or the difference between different areas. So once you've logged into Datashine, okay, I would like you to follow these instructions on this slide. So screenshot it or take a mental note or take a picture on your phone or something like that. Click on this data chooser bit, okay, select your data set, try and look at the map to work out what the data set is showing you. They're not worded in the most friendly way, okay, but ideally you'll get an idea about where in Norwich is sort of more or less deprived. So try and include, okay, data from deprivation, data from health and education. Those three as a minimum I would go with. So look at population basics is what you'd find in where you'd find deprivation. Health is its own little category there, and education is there. So try and get some data for each of these and take a little screenshot so you've got a series of maps. So what I'd then like you to do is comment on your maps, so you're annotating them to identify the areas that have high or low deprivation, good or bad health, high levels or low levels of education overall. Okay, and then from that you'll have a really good idea of not only what Norwich is like and what parts of Norwich are like, but you'll also have a really good understanding of GIS and ways that it can be presented and ways the census can be presented. Okay, so have a go at doing that, and then I'll summarise that for you in the next couple of slides. So if you want to pause the screen now, I'd imagine this will take you a good 15 to 20 minutes. So it's something which does require you to have a little bit of a play around with. So off you go, do that, pause the screen, and when you're ready, you can unpause and I'll carry on. Okay, so this is a map of Norwich which shows, again, deprivation dimensions. And what I can do here, this is an example of an annotation that you may have identified. So areas of Milecross, which are here, Bowthorpe over here, and Crome as well, which is sort of over here. They've got actually Crome is over here. They've got the highest number of households with deprivation. So the larger proportion of houses that are classed as deprived are in that area, ranging from 18.4% to 28.1% of homes in those areas. Now, I've tried to identify a reason why that might be, and based on our information about Norwich, this might be because they're more social housing. So there's lots of social housing in Milecross and the Bowthorpe regions, which were built in the 60s during the suburban kind of growth of Norwich, or one area of suburban growth and renewal in Norwich. And they really are people housed on lower incomes. They're packed together. There's not loads of green space. So this might be why the deprivation is quite so high in those areas. And there you go. I've highlighted those areas for you. You've got these 3 red zones there. Areas such as Catton Grove Ward, which is on the rural urban fringe, which you can see there, but also the Nelson Ward, which is in a city here. You can see how green those areas are, and green means they are very low in terms of their deprivation. So the percentage without deprivation, this is the higher the number, the better, really. The ranges are from sort of 67%, but effectively it shows you these places are the least deprived in Norwich. And again, that might be up here particularly because the rural urban fringe has got bigger houses, newer houses, and there's much more green space. And this part, because it's in the inner city and it's so green, just like up here over in the sort of Silver Street area, this tells you probably that this area has been redeveloped and gentrified a little bit for the wealthy young professionals. So there we go. We've got the deprived areas of Bowthorpe, Milecross and Crome, and then you've got your Catton Grove Ward and your Nelson Ward here, which are very least deprived areas really of Norwich in terms of housing, in terms of the quality of the housings there, because rural urban fringe and maybe urban regeneration. There we go. So this map is tying in a lot of our knowledge into one of these maps. Now that's for deprivation. I'm hoping you've got a good idea about education and health as well. So now we're going to move on to this concept and this horribly big word of deindustrialisation. Now this is going to require you to go onto 365 and get the information and the sheets that are on 365 saved for you, including a challenging text task. But before we do, I'm just going to show you what Norwich looked like back in the day. So this, believe it or not, is Norwich. It's a black and white photo of it, obviously, but what you can see here you might not recognise very much. This is AJ Cayley and Sons Limited, and you may not have heard of this before, but this whole area here, if I sort of took that away and put Chapelfield Shopping Centre there, you might recognise it a bit better. What you can see here, this sort of black mass, these are green trees, they just don't look green. This is Chapelfield Gardens, and so Chapelfield Gardens, which is where you've got the busy roads there, they've got the roundabout at the top there. This up here is the Roman Catholic Cathedral. You might be able to make that out from there. But this now has all been knocked down. Okay, it's an old chocolate factory. It's been knocked down and replaced with Chapelfield Shopping Centre. So there's Chapelfield Gardens, and there's the old chocolate factory, which was a massive, massive site. But you wouldn't have ever known that was there because in your lifetime it's always been Chapelfield. So deindustrialisation is defined as the decline of industrial activity in a region. So please get this definition to start with. You know what the Industrial Revolution is. It's the growth of industry in towns and cities. So deindustrialisation is just the opposite of that happening. It's the decline. It's the removal of that industrial activity in an area, largely old factories. Okay, so once you've got that definition written down, we're going to start to work out the reasons for deindustrialisation and apply it to our city of Norwich. So you're going to be building a mind map. Now this is going to be quite big, but the handout and the information you need is on the handout for this mind map to be completed. Okay, so you're going to be building up a mind map showing the causes of deindustrialisation in Norwich, and what I'd like you to do is just start by copying the structure that you can see below. Okay, so do that now please, copy that structure, and then when you're finished you can carry on, and I'll carry on talking. Okay, so hopefully you've covered those, and you've got those bits done. What I'd like you now to add are the following definitions. So these white bits, I'm sorry this has appeared at the bottom, I'm not sure why. So these white sections, these are definitions for one each of these things. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is try and read through and then match the definition to the correct term. So in a minute, okay, I'm going to go through and give you the answers, but what I'd like you to do is pause the screen and try and work out which is which first. Okay, so you've got globalization, decentralization, technological advances, and transport developments. Hopefully they're fairly self-explanatory, but each one of these belongs to one of these headings. So pause the screen, do that now, and when you're ready you can unpause the screen. Okay, so let's start with this first definition. The spreading of power or people away from a central location. For example, many firms now have their factories in different parts of the world with only the headquarters remaining in that country. This can also be called outsourcing. This is decentralization. You're moving things away from the center or central locations. Cities become part of the world market and products and ideas are being spread around the world. Countries become interdependent. That means they rely on each other. That's globalization. Improvements in transport means that goods can be moved around the world more easily and quickly. Aircraft, containerization, motorways, all the way across Europe means it's cheaper and easier to transport things back to the UK. That's transport developments. And then lastly, firms can have branch plants all over the world and still keep in touch because of technological advances like the internet. So that helps globalization, but it also means that some industries are less relevant. So there's online magazines and apps rather than actual newspapers and things like that. So this one is technological advances. So these definitions belong to the different sections here. So remember, this one is decentralization, globalization, transport developments, and technological advances. Okay, make sure you've got the right answers there, and now we're going to add some Norwich specific information. Okay, so looking at these yellow sections, each one of these represents an example of globalization, decentralization, technological advances and transport developments for Norwich specifically. So pay attention to some of these things because you should know some of these, and some of these you might not know, but you will by the end of this session. So pause the screen, try and match these up correctly, and then when you're ready, unpause the screen and I'll go over the answers for you. Okay, so the developing of smartphones and apps led to a decline in hard copy magazines and newspapers. So Gerald's, Gerald's, the really lovely department store that's there, they actually had a printing area, which is now a museum. They still do print some stuff, but they lost out as the need to print paper declined a lot because people weren't buying magazines and newspapers as much. So this one is technological advances because it literally directly applies to the growth of things like apps and smartphones and stuff. Nestle, again the confectionery manufacturer, they closed down their chocolate factory in Norwich to reduce costs and move operations to a place called York, which is in Yorkshire, believe it or not, with global competition and the trade of international brands like Mars being easier with advertising. So basically Nestle lost out to places of competition like Mars because there was lots of global advertising going on. So this is globalization. Following the growth of the road networks, factories located in city centres became unsuitable for large lorries and freight traffic. That means that basically if you had a big factory in the middle of a city, it couldn't get out to the major roads to get the goods out and in. So the Startright factory, which if you know Norwich well, and the Brickmakers pub, just away from that towards home base on the right, there's a curry house called Rishi, which I've been told is very good. Just after that, there's like a derelict site, which is where the old Starrite factory used to be located. Now they make shoes, and they're really good quality shoes as well. But they make shoes, and they demolished their factory and then moved it to Broadland Business Park, which is near the A47 and also near the NDR. So essentially, it gave them better access to good roads. And quick access to maybe the airport if they needed to go there, for example, because it was easier to get to and from these major roads to where the products needed to be and where the goods to make the products needed to come to. So Broadland Business Park was the new home for the Starrite factory for shoes, and where it used to be quite close to the city centre. So this one is transport developments. And then lastly, this one is decentralisation. Industrial parks open up on the edge of Norwich, for example, Pfeiffer's Lane in Helsden, which is near the airport, which led to the decline in the inner city because there's better access, greater population to draw workers from. So this is our example of sort of decentralisation in Norwich. Okay, so there we go. We've got these matched up as well. Now, make sure you've got the right answers, and then we're going to sort of summarise the session. So the last thing we need to look at, you just looked at the causes of deindustrialisation, and obviously with the closure of factories and the moving of industry, there's going to be some impacts as well. Now those impacts are highlighted quite nicely in the challenging text task, which talks to you about all sorts of different places specific to Norwich, including this place here, Sovereign House, and this is Gerald's here as well. And what I'd like you to do is, this is on 365, so find the copy, is pick out the key information with regards to impacts of deindustrialisation. So think about numbers of jobs lost, and then again specifically name companies, etc., because all this specific detail is handy for when it comes to doing an exam question, and also just enriching your knowledge of Norwich in general. Okay, so once you've completed that, that is the end of the session. So well done for listening. This is a really good session with regards to learning a little bit more about Norwich actually, and a bit more in-depth information about the history of Norwich and its industry. And I know a lot of you probably wish there was still a chocolate factory there, but I'm sure you wouldn't want to say goodbye to Chapelfield Regenerated Shopping Centre anyway, or either, sorry. So well done for listening, and I will see you next time.